Okay, everybody. So my name is Koben Shigeta. I have been in 4-H and FFA for most of my life. I know some of you have probably met me or know me. President of the Snake River Meat Goat Association. You see me at a lot of the fairs. Um, we've been involved in ruminants for a long time, and kind of want to make this for all the 4-H leaders and other groups around that are trying to help the kids to learn more, and using my knowledge to kind of get you there. So this is going to be a pretty basic presentation, just kind of going over the basic stuff, and we will have a whole lot more stuff coming, a whole lot more videos over feed selection and all that. But I want to get started with something here. So let's go ahead and move forward, and I'll tell you a little bit about me. So, my background, I was born and raised in Nampa, Idaho. I moved to Ontario, Oregon whenever I was in middle school. Funny thing about me is I never had interest in livestock. I never thought that I was going to work in agriculture. I never wanted to work in agriculture. Uh, my dad had a family farm, we had a machine shop, and I was certain that someday I was going to go into medical, particularly human medicine. But that ended up kind of not happening. So, how my story started was I found FFA as a freshman in high school. And I didn't think I was going to stick it out, but they nailed me with the member of the month, which I found out was just one of those things they gave you if you walked through the door as a freshman. But that kind of made me feel important and made me feel like I wanted to keep doing FFA. And so I continued on my journey with FFA. I participated in all their public speaking competitions, and I really pushed myself beyond the limits of my comfort, which is what I find in life to be honestly the most helpful thing to learn is to put yourself in a position where you don't feel comfortable, because that's when you learn the most. I feel like if we stay comfortable where we're at, it means we're not really showing our full potential. And so I have to really thank FFA, for doing that. And my advisor, Les Liniger, I know a lot of people still know about him. He's quite a legend with his wife, Marie. But they kind of started me on this trip. So my trip started with sheep. I raised club lambs with a good friend of mine when I think I was doing it my sophomore year of high school, and it was pretty eye-opening experience for me. Sheep are not the smartest animal to raise, but they're definitely okay to show. And if you want to show an animal that you got to hang on to and rip around a pen, the sheep is where it was at. But I really found a love for club stock and sheep, and I kept with it. And I ended up getting married. I married a woman named Kayla. She loved goats. She loved dairy goats. And coming out of the, show stock industry of club lambs, I really wasn't into dairy goats because I really didn't like, how small they were, the way they look, the way they cry. I didn't like anything about that. So I told her we could have goats, and we got into some meat goats. And that kind of really kicked off, where I'm at today, and honestly pushed me towards what I wanted to do in my life. So, I got into goats. I started to have this love for livestock. I enjoyed hogs. I enjoyed sheep. I really enjoyed the meat goats. I dabbled a little bit in beef cow, dairy cow. Um, and that kind of got me into the field that I'm in veterinary medicine, and now going to vet school. I'm a second year student at Corvallis, Oregon State University, Carlson College of Vet Medicine. It's a great school. It's a hard school to get into. If somebody was interested in getting into vet school, I'm definitely a good person to talk to, and we can talk about that. But we'll just keep going on. So anyway, all this stuff though in my life started honestly with livestock. And so I'm really passionate about it. I'm really passionate about the kids that are doing it. And I think it's really important that we keep teaching kids, what they need to know. So here we go. This is what I've learned. And the main thing I've learned is you got to ask yourself questions, when you start these types of things. So, what kind of project do you want? I mean, are you looking at sheep? Are you looking at goats? Do you want to get into cattle? Is it possible to have many? So I know a lot of kids are running, sheep and goats, or they've got some project steers, they've got project hogs, they got project goats. It's honestly sky's the limit. There's a lot of things that go into that about housing animals together and whatnot, but that's not something we're going to get into in this particular video, but we will definitely be getting into that information. Another question are, what are things I need to consider when having many? And that, again, that's going to be in another video. but just kind of an example. Sheep are super toxic to copper, and whereas goats absolutely have to have copper. So when you're raising sheep and goats together, they can't have the same mineral. And if they have the same mineral, you may find yourself with some sheep that are dying off because they just have too much copper in their system. So, those are really important things to consider. If you're going to have many and you're going to have different species, what are the different species, specifications? What do they need? I think a really big question too is, what are my current facilities set up for? When I was in school, kids would raise these hogs and they'd raise them in town and do it without the city knowing. And it really wasn't enough area for the pigs. Their yard wasn't made for those pigs. They didn't have settings set up for those pigs. And, I think it's really important to dictate what your project is going to be based on what you can do. Um, and then another thing is, what's my base knowledge in what I'm about to pursue? That's a huge, huge, huge deal. If today you just decided, hey, I'm going to go out there and raise some club hogs, or I'm going to go out there and raise a goat, and you have no idea how to raise a goat, you don't know anything about goats, it's going to make the beginning of your project so much more difficult. It's going to make it to where your animal may not do as well as it needs to do. And honestly, working in vet medicine, this is where we find problems where, youth are bringing in animals that have water belly. They're bringing in bloated animals. They're bringing in animals that got hurt from something in their yard. And all this went back down to that base knowledge. What did they know about this species before they got into it? And a lot of people really kind of jump into things with the cart before the horse, and that kind of goes off now to, do I have good resources to make this happen? We have to ask ourselves, what is the definition of a resource? Resources can be a lot of things. First of all, resources go back to that whole, do you have the facilities to set it up? What's your property look like? Do you have enough land to do it? Do you have the monetary resources to put up a pen to have that animal in? And do you have the monetary resources to provide the quality food that it needs to have to finish out its project? That's a super important part of raising livestock, is husbandry. And a big part of husbandry is, unfortunately, monetary financial stability. These animals cost a lot to raise, and they also take a lot of time. And then we can think about resources and knowledge base. Do you have resources? Do you have a 4-H leader who understands your specific species? Do they have experience raising that species? Do they know how to help you raise that species? And then off with that education, we can also piggyback on there. Do you have a veterinarian that you feel comfortable talking to, someone that you can go to if you have questions, who can meet you in the middle of the night when you've got something going on? There's so many resources that you need to consider. What do you have in order to make this project even, a workable project? And then kind of the biggest two questions that I like to end this off with is, what are your expectations of yourself? And a lot about raising these projects is about you. What do you want? Do you want to win? Are you willing to get up in the middle of the morning or in the middle of the afternoon, middle of the night, early morning with the chickens to make sure that your stuff is done? Are you going to be out there working that animal? Are you going to be taking the time to clean the feeders, to get them out and do the exercising? Are you going to be participating in feed conversions and how you're putting those together? Will you be going to the shows? Will you be practicing? There are just so many things that you have to ask yourself. What do you expect of yourself? And I think it's a good idea to get a notepad and set realistic goals for yourself. Like, this year, I would like to try to make sure that I can get my project out at least 4 times a week for exercise. I think that's a really great goal. I think if you set a goal to, I'm going to exercise my project 6 times a day, is that a realistic goal? Probably not. And so it's really important that you make expectations of yourself and you set goals that you can achieve. And there's always wiggle room to increase your goals as you're in it. So it's best to start a little lower and work yourself up. And then, what are your expectations of your project? And again, a lot of that goes back to what your expectations were of yourself, because your project is directly a reflection of the work that you put in, right? But we also have to think about our project. And when we say expectations of our project, then we talk about where are you going to get your project? How much money are you going to spend for your project? You know, how much, what kind of feed are you going to put into your project? How much are you going to feed your project? And kind of with that information, how do you expect to place whenever you go to fair or the jackpots? And I think that setting up these goals and looking at your expectations of yourself and your project will really kind of help you mold together what exactly you want to do this year in 4-H or FFA or your jackpots, whatever you're doing. And I also want to say this is probably a really good time to pause, go get yourself a notebook and be prepared to take notes, because while I do follow the slideshow, there's a lot of things that I say that are helpful that I definitely probably don't have in the script. So go ahead, take a second, go get that notebook, and we'll continue forward. Okay, so let's get started with the basics. I already made the comment earlier, let's not put the cart before the horse. And what that means is, what do we need to do before we even have our project? Basic facilities are required. And those are still facilities that we need for a small ruminant project is, in my opinion, a smaller pen. I see too often people are putting goats and sheep out into big old pastures and they're complaining and saying, you know, Koben, I can't get my animals to put any weight on. And it starts right here. You need to have a small pen. And what I like to do is a 12 by 12 pen. You also need to have water troughs, ones that can be easily cleaned. I know a lot of people are using buckets. Buckets are great. You know what the problem is with buckets though? They get pooped in, they get stepped on, they get knocked over, they grow mold faster because they have less surface area, so they get hot quicker. And that goes back to the water too. When it's 100 degrees outside, that bucket gets hot. And when that bucket gets hot, that water gets hot. And when the water gets hot, they don't want to drink. So it's important to have a proper water trough. And in the summer, you might have to dump those out and put fresh water in because it's just too darn hot. Then we look at grain feeders and hay feeders. And it kind of depends on what you're feeding. And we'll go into feed, and I'll go into this a little bit more in a feed discussion. But my biggest kind of take home message here is that they need to be off the ground. I know a lot of people are using pans on the ground. You know, they've got those plastic feeders that you can lay down. That's kind of like mostly for horses. We don't want to use those because every time our goat or sheep poops in that pan, we're potentially pushing the parasite issues, coccidia issues, and those things aren't going to help your project continue to gain weight and be successful. So make sure you do yourself a favor and go to the store and buy some grain feeders and hay feeders that you can keep off the ground. And then another really big part is shelter. In the summertime, when those goats and sheep are sweating and it's hot and they're panting, you know what they're doing? They're burning calories. And so it's really important to make sure that they have a shelter that's at least 3 sides, preferably 3 1/4. And the reason why I say a quarter and not a half is because sheep and goats are prey animals. And oftentimes, if they're going to go into something that they can't see out of, they're not going to use it. And so you could get away easily with a 3 sided shelter and just point it in a way where the wind isn't blowing into it, just so that they can have shade if they need it and to get out of the rain if they need to. Because again, if our animals are hot or they're too cold, they're going to be burning calories, either trying to heat up or trying to cool down. So make sure you have a good shelter. And then last is what nobody wants to talk about, easy access into the pen with a wheelbarrow. Yes, you need to go into the pen and clean it. Yes, you do need to do that at least weekly. I would say, every 3 to 4 days, but people don't do that. Sometimes I don't do that. So if I can get to it weekly, I'm pretty happy. But that's a really important thing to do because, again, we're trying to get the parasite issues under control. We're trying to keep all the feed off the ground. We're trying to prevent our animals from getting some kind of secondary issue so that we can have a successful project. So make sure that when you set up your pen, you can get a wheelbarrow in there and it's easy to get around and get out of. So I talked about pen size, and that pen size is important. And I just want to hone in on here again how important pen size is. And this is just a picture of a goat that I have that got out of its pen. So proper fencing super important. Don't forget that. And it kind of goes back to that pasture thing. We look at, okay, here's kind of some of the things you can do, either a pasture pen or a dry lot pen. And I kind of gave cons to both. Pasture pinning, the problem with pasture is if you're not rotating your pastures well, you're going to have issues with parasite overload. Um, and with these market projects and stuff, that's something I try to stay away from. I can't keep control of this animal that's in this pasture. I don't know what it's getting into out there all the time, and it's a lot of space for them to run. So they're burning calories. They're running all over the place. They could be falling on stuff, bumping some legs. So honestly, when it comes to club stock or anything that I'm about to put into a show, I want to put it in somewhat like a small dry lot, that I can walk up to there. I can get into there quickly. I can get a hold of the animal quickly, and it just makes it a little bit easier. But let's just go back. So pasture parasite control, that's a big issue. Expensive fencing. So I realize that the panel fencing is expensive, and that's what I use in my dry lots. But when you set up a pasture, fencing, it's expensive. You got to run a lot of fencing. You got to make sure it's taunt enough to keep those animals in clearly. Based on my picture, I'm not so good at setting up good fencing because my goats sometimes get out. But it's one of those things, and you're always fixing fence when you have a pasture. And depending on the wire that you use, those goats can get their heads stuck in it. There's just all kinds of things that can happen with that. So that's just kind of a con for pasture. And then, of course, irrigation, whether you're flood irrigating or doing a sprinkler, we have to then think about liver flukes. There's just a lot that goes into that with the pasture. What's growing in the pasture? What kind of plants are growing in the pasture? If there's any kind of toxic plants in the pasture. But on the pro side, pasture is really nice. Sometimes if that's all you have and that's what you have set up, that's kind of what you got to do, and there's ways to get around that. So if you've got a pasture and you need a smaller pen, you can always put up a little bit of a smaller pen inside of that pasture. But those are kind of just some things to think about. And then dry lots. I said expensive. And the reason why I say expensive is because in a dry lot, we're feeding animals alfalfa. Well, basically, this is what we're bringing food to the dry lot. And so it can be more expensive. In the pasture, we're feeding animals what grows in the grass naturally. But in the dry lot, we have to provide them alfalfa. We have to provide them alfalfa hay or what are the grass hay, and we've got to bring the grain to them. And then also exercise is required. So they're not running in a big pen. So that means that you're going to have to go in there, you're going to have to hook up that animal, and you're going to have to get it out and get it exercised. And lastly, which is my biggest take home message, bigger is not always better. And so why I said that again is when you think about a pasture, let's say you've got a 2-acre pasture, how many more calories is that animal going to burn running those 2 acres than if it was sitting in a 12 by 12 pen? And so you're buying grain at probably, I don't know what the going cost is right now, but let's say it's anywhere between $15 a bag to $30 a bag. And you're dumping this expensive grain into this animal. You're dumping in this expensive alfalfa, dairy quality hay, or whatever you're feeding, grass hay. And then that little critter just runs out there and rips all over that pasture. You know, you're not putting on those calories. I mean, really what we're trying to do is we're trying to bulk up and then we're trying to cut so we look like we're thick. We got a lot of muscle. And honestly, just running them on pasture isn't the right kind of exercise. There's just so many other things that could happen that just it doesn't make sense to have them in a big area. And then apt to injury. The reason why I say this is because I know a lot of people in their pastures have rocks in their pastures, broken down fencing. And you can see in my pasture, I've got some old tractors. And that just kind of is something normal we see out here in the country of just crap in a pasture. And goats, not so much sheep. Sheep, when I had sheep, they like to get stuck in things. Goats don't get stuck in things. Goats like to jump off of things or jump into things and break their cannon bone. So either way, there's always a possibility of injury the more room they have to run. And so that's something to consider too. And that's why I also don't ever recommend putting like toys or spools inside of a dry lot pen, just because the less stuff that they could hurt themselves on, the better. So we'll keep going forward here. So how I set up dry lots for show stock. So again, when I raise show stock, we put them in dry lots and I pin them in a 12 by 12 pin. And that's just, those stock panels, the wire panels that you can get at D&B, Tractor Supply, Coastal, wherever your feed store is, they've probably got that ranch wire panel. And 5 to 6 foot. 6 foot's probably better. 5 foot's great, but I would put those, well, 5 by 12, 6 by 12. But I would definitely put up a pin that's like 12 by 12, and then make sure that you set that pin up to where you can hang feeders on the opposite end of the water, and you can hang feeders high enough so that your stock can't climb into them. And sheep, they're not as notorious to do this. I have had sheep jump into their feeders, but goats are really super bad about it. And so really, I mean, you don't want to keep the feeder too high off the ground because you want that animal to be able to get into it, but they probably will jump in it too. So it's really important that you clean those feeders so that they're not eating, fecal contents every day that are loaded with parasites or coccidia. Um, and why it's so important to hang those feeders on the opposite end of the water is just so that they're not standing there and eating their hay or their grain and then pooping in their water. I'm just trying to make your life easier so that you don't have to do as much at home. So what do we feed? And I guess, I don't know, I thought about putting this slide into this slideshow and I wasn't sure. And this is going to be a whole other video about feed, just because feed is such an important component into raising these animals. But I think it's really important, as far as in the basics, to get yourself prepared for what you're going to be feeding, and how you're going to go about it. So kind of the main thing I want to talk about is, what are you feeding as far as male or female? And it really does matter. So does and ewes, they've got, a short urethra. You don't have to worry so much about the urinary stones as with them. I mean, they can definitely get them, but we have to consider that more in our wethers and our rams and bucks. Um, Another thing about these guys is they are ruminants, and they have one stomach with 4 compartments. What that means is that they can break down plant material, and it takes more time. They're really, really great at converting bad feeds into higher quality fatty acids. And there's a lot of that I'm going to go into in another video. But when you get these animals, you need to be getting a hold of people either looking for alfalfa, grass alfalfa, or grass. And your grain supplement is probably going to be a corn-based barley, something like that. Sweet feed, I try to stay away from. Again, though, we're going to talk about that. And then a TMR is like a total mixed ration. And that's kind of like the pellets that you buy that say like goat feed. So I know Purina makes a really great one. Payback makes a really good one. Mormons makes a great one. So there's just a lot of stuff that we can look into. And then there's supplements that you're eventually going to need to look into for your animals, and mineral. Mineral is a really super important thing here, especially in Eastern Oregon. Actually, all of basically this coastline, we are selenium deficient, and it's important to have a selenium mineral out there with those animals. And with these guys, considering that they are more browsers, not grazers, their lips are super mobile, it's important to use like a texturized mineral. And again, though, that's going to go into a whole nother video. But most importantly here, I want to make a comment is that if you're raising sheep and goats together, they absolutely cannot have the same mineral. Sheep cannot have a lot of copper. Goats absolutely need to have a lot of copper. And these are definitely things that you need to consider if you're going to be doing kind of a dual species. So let's keep going forward. Special considerations. All right. So does, like I said, and ewes have a much shorter urethra. So they're less likely to get urinary stones, at least built up. They will pass them. But the bucks and wethers, they've got a much longer urethra. They've got this thing called a sigmoid flexure. That's a part of their penis. It literally looks like a tight S. If something gets stuck in there, boy, it is hard to get it unstuck. They also have a urinary process on the tip of their penis. A lot of people call it a pizzle, as kind of a layman's terms. Stuff gets stuck there too. It's a tiny little thing, and little pebbles get in there. And when that kind of stuff happens, we're looking at an emergency situation. And that oftentimes, in my experience, has not always been fixable. And it's quite the ordeal. I don't know how many goats and sheep I see a year at the vet clinic that come in with a bladder that's already ruptured, or a urethra that is ruptured, and now they've got urine in their body cavity, and we end up having to euthanize those animals. It's just super important. And kind of the big push take home here is that it's 100% preventable from feed. If you're feeding the right calcium to phosphorus ratio, if you're providing an ammonium chloride supplement, it may not be a complete fail safe, but it helps. And having fresh water, if they've got really crappy water and they don't want to drink, and they're eating all this stuff and they got all this salt and they're starting to produce these stones, it just causes it to concentrate. And then they're not passing those stones or fragments of stones like they need to. And so there's just a lot of things that go into this, which is why I always say, it's important to be mindful about picking feeds, what you're feeding, how much you're feeding. And again, that's a whole other video. It's going to be a long video of just feed. So we will definitely be getting into that. But these are considerations you need to consider when you're thinking about what kind of project am I going to raise? What kind of time am I going to have? What kind of, things do I need to know? This is going back to that whole base knowledge. Like, what do I know first about this animal or about raising these animals before I even buy this animal? So we're just basically trying to get this horse set up for a cart, right? So we will continue to go further into this video. So basic husbandry equipment. What this means to me, husbandry is like taking care of your animals, and you cannot raise livestock, take care of livestock if you don't have any way to transport your projects. Goats and sheep don't always get really big. Sheep a lot bigger than goats. I don't think that you could stuff sheep necessarily into a large dog crate. You could definitely stuff a project goat if it was a young one into a large dog crate. If you've got a horse trailer, stock trailer, utility trailer, just some ways to get them there that's safe. Care of feet. This is a big part of husbandry. You cannot let their feet overgrow. It changes the way they walk. It changes the way they move. It hurts their joints. It'll cause them to have inflammation and lameness. So it's really important to take care of their feet. And if you don't know how to take care of their feet, this is again why it goes back to the very beginning of this slideshow about having resources and people available. Your 4-H leaders, they should know how to do trimming feet. That is just a basic common knowledge thing that they should know. And if they don't know that, then you need to reach out to somebody who does, because this is such an important part of raising animals, is making sure that they've got the right shoes on and that they can get to the feeder and get out of the feeder with ease. Hair and wool care, so we're going to talk about that a bit in a later video when we talk about parasites, specifically, and talk about lice, keds, mange, biting lice, sucking lice. So we need to be looking at hair. If we're losing hair, or we need to be thinking about what we've got going on and if we need a medicated shampoo or what. And then, of course, when we go into the fitting and the clipping and everything else, it's going to be really important that we're keeping good care of these hair, because it makes a big difference in the ring. And then also halters. You got to have halters to move these animals around. You've got to have halters to hold them and tie them to places. And it's like one of those things that you would think is just common sense, but a lot of times we forget the halters at home, and we've got to have them. So it's just important to have a halter, and really a good idea to have a halter that's best for your species. For show equipment, we're looking at a stand. So we definitely need to have something to put our animals on. A blower. Now, you don't necessarily have to have a blower, but what I will say is this: when you wash that animal and blow them out that morning for the show, they look fresh. They look like they have bloom. They look like they're ready to go into the ring and kick tail. If you wash those animals the night before, towel dry them and let them dry overnight, they lay down in the bedding, they get dirty again, and they don't have that bloom. When you first do your hair and blow it out, it's got all that volume. You're just not going to find that. And so I think if you're going to get into this and you're going to stay in this really hard and you're going to get into breeding animals, a blower and a stand are absolutely necessary. If you're raising market lambs and market goats and you're going to slick shear these guys, then it's okay. You don't necessarily need to have a blower, so long as you can get them dry, keep them clean, whether you want to put them in one of those little slinkies or whatever they call them, that helps out a lot. But, if you're going to get serious into this, a stand and a blower really are helpful. And then show halters. I cannot say enough about show halters in this. So this is one of those things where, is it political? Is it not political? Who knows? But this is what I do know. These show halters can come in different forms and different styles. There are show halters. There are the pronged halters. There are the Springer type chain halters. And every fair, every county has different rules as to what their rules with the halters are. So it's your responsibility as a youth member, as a parent, as a 4-H leader, whatever. It's your responsibility to figure out what those rules are, and your 4-H book should have that in the rules. Your FFA information should have that in the rules. When you go to a jackpot show, they should have rules, and those are important things to get comfortable with and to know immediately right off the bat, because as you work this animal all this year, this summer, you need to know exactly what kind of halter you're allowed to use so that you can train your project on that halter. Like, I cannot say this enough. This is the most important part of showing animals, is making sure you're getting them on the right halter and working them on the right halter. So I can't stress it enough. If you don't know your county's rules, get a hold of your county and figure out their rules. And remember that their rules are their rules. I wouldn't fight the rules. If, just do what they ask you to do. And it's easy. Anybody can show on any kind of halter so long as you start early. And so make sure you get that done. And then there's tie-up halters. So just like the rope halters, those are really, really handy when you're showing multiple animals and then you're swapping back and forth between your show halter and just a regular halter. So make sure you have that. Show products. This is going to be something we're going to talk about in fitting and clipping. But again, while you're at your 4-H office or talking to your FFA advisor or whatever, make sure you also look at the rules about what is allowed to be used as a show product in your county. Some counties will allow you to put baby powder on. Some counties will not. Some counties will let you bone legs with adhesive. Some counties are absolutely no on that. So that's really super important to know that before you start buying stuff to put into a box for your show season. And then last but not least, this is something that's always forgotten: show buckets and feeders. You have your feeders at home, you have your buckets at home. You get the animal, you get them in the truck, you get them down to the fairgrounds, and oh dang, we all forgot all their feeders and all their buckets. And it's a pain. It's a pain to take them down from your pens. So what I always recommend is having a separate set just for shows. It's clean, it's prettier, it's set up, it's already in your tack, and you never have to worry about forgetting it. And then I think this might be my last slide here, but so you want to raise a small ruminant project. And this is a picture of two 4-H girls that Kayla and I brought up. And, this is what I love about youth projects, and what I love about youth doing this is the camaraderie that they have, working together. The little gal in the orange won first place, but do you see the smile on the gal who's got the darker shirt on while she's shaking her hand? She lost, but you know what? She's still being, a great competitor, and she's showing a lot of maturity. And that's what 4-H is about. 4-H is about kids learning together, youth working together, working with parents and adults, and everybody kind of working together as a family and a community, because it takes a community to raise kids and to raise good kids. And it's just that nothing makes me prouder than seeing two kids that can shake each other's hands, and one be humble and one be gracious. That's what this is about. And so I hope after you guys watch all of my videos that you all come out kind of with that same mental mind frame when you raise these animals. You're not always going to win. And, if you always win, it doesn't help you in life. As I said in the very beginning about my life, I learn more when I'm under pressure. I learn more when I'm uncomfortable, and I learn more when I fail. I mean, you never forget what you did that was wrong, but it's easy to forget what you did that was right. Right. So it's like you learn the most from when you lose. And so that, just pushing that, I can't say it enough. You're going to hear me say it a lot in my videos about this is kind of what I think about the youth projects and what I want out of them. But be prepared to kind of try to be like that. But anyway, small ruminants are fun. They're a ton of fun. These guys, they're goofy. Goats are goofy. Sheep are goofy. They're easy to move around. They're small enough to handle, but they're also big enough to have a good time with. And honestly, as long as you've got your feeding and everything right, it should be a really good project for you.
Again, like I want to say, I've said over and over throughout this entire thing, sheep and goats are not the same. They are definitely not the same. They don't eat the same. They aren't the same species. And a lot of people think that they are, and they're just not. Um, and kind of what I want you to get by the end of this is to be thinking about what species you want. Uh, and what part of it are you going to go into? You know, whether you're going to be in market stock and you're going to be just showing animals based on weight for a terminal sale yard, or if you're going to be looking at breed stock, and that's going to be like a registry breed standard versus a club stock. Breed stock could be like your club stock is going to be your crosses, Boer cross Spanish, cross Kikos, cross whatever for that hybrid vigor. And then there's the Kiko Industries, there's the ABGA with the American Boer Goat Association, there's the Spanish Goat Association. So kind of depends on what thing you want to get into. Then there's pet classes. The pygmy goat is a meat goat. It's also a dairy goat. It's considered a pet goat. You know, so there's a lot of stuff that you can get involved in, and it's important to start thinking now with everything that I've told you. Kind of what do you want to do? Are you going to be in the breeding side of this? Are you going to be in just the terminal side of this? Where are you at with this? And are you going to want to raise your own projects, or are you going to want to buy your projects? You know, a lot of people will start out one year and buy a couple club animals from someone and raise them, and then feed them up, take them to the show, and then sell them. And then you got an empty pen and you wait till next year. Other people say, hey, you know, I kind of like that. I get tired of spending the $300 or whatever for that project lamb. I think I can raise my own. They go out there and buy themselves a ewe and a ram, and then they start a breeding project. Um, that's kind of, and it's kind of a cool thing too. And then you're taking your own project to your own fair or your own jackpot or whatever, wherever you're showing, you know. So that's kind of cool too. And there's a lot that goes into that if that's what you're going to do. There's a lot that goes into selection of livestock and a lot that goes into the breeding of livestock. And that's definitely another whole nother video that we're going to have to dive into to discuss that. But anyway, you know, just getting started here, I just wanted to get everybody's feet a little bit wet with this information, kind of get that out there, get your mind thinking about stuff. And then as you've started thinking about this, then we can start getting into the more specific things about which species you're going to buy, what you're going to get into, if you're going to be breeding, how to feed that animal, parasites. We're going to go over everything. So anyway, I've really enjoyed having you guys. And I'm excited to make some more videos for you. All right. Thanks for tuning in.